Hi, everybody. I'm Jody Schneider with Bloomberg News and president of the FCC, and I'd like to welcome you to our panel, The Hong Kong Protests, What Happened and What's Next. And before I introduce our panelists, I would like to first tell you about a few upcoming events. First of all, if you haven't seen it downstairs, we have a photo exhibit, our wall exhibit this month by Vincent Yu, black and white photos, many of Hong Kong. So please go take a look at those. They'll be up all month. We have, on July 17th, we have the quiz night. I think there's still some tables open. And on July 24th, we have the vegan dinner. We have a special vegan chef. And so please, if you can come, that'll be a nice evening as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce this timely panel right in the thick of the Hong Kong protests. It will be moderated by Shabani Matani, who's our moderator for today. She's with the Washington Post. She's been covering the protests, and she is a board member. She's on the Board of Governors. I did want to say before I introduce the panelists that we sought to include voices from the government and the police and extended invitations to them. We will continue to extend invitations to them in the future. This is not the only panel we will be doing on this topic, and we will also be doing some workshops for journalists in covering protests and related issues. So if members or guests have suggestions and ideas or panelists for future events, please be in touch with me or other board members. With that, I'd like to include the panelists. Besides Shabani, we have Antony Dapiran, who is a Hong Kong-based lawyer and writer and the author of City of Protest, A Recent History of Dissent in Hong Kong. He has written and presented extensively on China and Hong Kong politics, business and culture, and has written for various outlets on the Hong Kong protests. And if you haven't been reading him on Twitter, you haven't been reading Twitter. Another person very active on Twitter is Mary Wei. She's a reporter for Quartz based in Hong Kong, where she covers Asia business and geopolitics and has been very active in covering the protest in Hong Kong. And we're very proud at the FCC to say that she is one of the 2 recipients of the inaugural Claire Hollingworth Fellowship. And you know, what better time to get the fellowship? So we're very pleased that we can say that today. And Mary is, I'm sure, will be a terrific panelist. And we also are including on the panel Bonnie Leung, who's the vice convener of the Civil Human Rights Front, which is an organization that has been involved in the protest. She's been involved in politics since 2008, starting as a student intern in the Civic Party, and she's been political assistant to former legislator Alan Leung until 2016, when she decided, when she was elected, as district councilor for the Eastern District, and she decided to participate more in social movements inspired by the Umbrella Movement in 2014. So I leave you to our panelists. We are going to have questions afterwards, so we'll leave time for that. And if you can, when you ask a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel. I'm just going to have our panelists sort of give a brief 5 minutes sort of introduction about themselves and sort of how they've been involved in observing, covering in some cases, and sort of planning these protests. Maybe we can start with you, Bonnie. Talk a little bit about the role of CHRF in organizing some of these big rallies that we've seen over the past month.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Bonnie Leung from Civic Party and also the Civil Human Rights Front. The Civil Human Rights Front has been established since 2003 when the anti-Article 23 campaign was at its heat. So now we include 50 organizations, NGOs, and political parties. And as you see, in every 1st of July, we hold marches, demonstrations, and when there are important social issues which request Hong Kong people to come out and voice out our opinion, the Civil Human Rights Front is always expected to organize these kind of marches. So if you had ever reported about the mass marches in Hong Kong, it's probably organized organised by the front. I also talk a little bit about myself. As is said before, I was inspired to enter politics during the anti-Article 23 movement. And at that point, Hong Kong people, I believe, we believe that when we would come out to the society, when we take to the streets, for example, like in 2003 and 2004, 500,000 people took to the streets, and then the government backed down and they withdraw the Article 23 bill. So that was a hopeful phrase of a social movement of Hong Kong. But afterwards, as we've seen in 2014, after the umbrella movement, the police force had dropped tear gas bombs into its people, which had not been seen after the handover. And people were, protesters, were risking our lives, risking of facing legal consequences. And still, the government and Beijing government did not back down. So it has been a huge change of the attitude of Hong Kong government and also Beijing government. So after the umbrella movement, I'm sure a lot of Hong Kong people, as I do, was very depressed. And we did not know where to go if we had already tried to risk our life to make our city to become a better place, and the government still not backing down. What else can we do? And I believe that in this movement, the anti-extradition bill movement, I think that we have find hope again. Although I do not want to sort of claim victory, because our 5 demands had still not been met, but at least we are getting something. And why I say I'm hopeful is because I believe after the umbrella movement, Hong Kong people, Hong Kong protesters, politicians, we all had evolved ourselves. We learned from our past experience, and we are coming out again this year in better shape, better form, and we are doing better. So I can't wait to share with you my experiences and my observations. Thank you.
Great point for you to jump in, Anthony. You've of course been, a keen observer of protest culture in Hong Kong, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how things have evolved and changed from the Umbrella Revolution in 2014.
Yeah, sure. Really, in the 2 years since my book City of Protest came out, one of the most common questions that I got was, is protest dead in Hong Kong? And people, when they asked that question, were pointing to two things. First, they pointed to what they said was the failure of the umbrella movement. Now, I think that itself is slightly questionable. While certainly the umbrella movement protesters' demands were not met, the umbrella movement itself had many other victories in terms of the political awakening that Bonnie just referred to, and the same political awakening that brought the Youngspiration and Demosisto legislators into office, notwithstanding what happened subsequently. I think the umbrella movement was very notable as a cultural event. You're thinking of the art, the cinema, the documentary film, the community organizing that was inspired by the umbrella movement. And then also in itself what the umbrella movement taught Hong Kong's activists and protesters about protest strategy and tactics, and again, what Bonnie alluded to just now. But anyway, certainly the umbrella movement protesters didn't achieve their aims, their demands were not met, and so that's one thing that I think led to some disappointment and disillusionment among protesters in Hong Kong. And then the second thing that people had pointed to was what had happened in the 2 years or so, or the ensuing years, now 5 years, since the umbrella movement. The Hong Kong government fairly systematically began to crack down on dissent and dissenting voices in Hong Kong in different ways. There was, of course, the oath-swearing controversy, which led to a number of pan-Dem legislators being disqualified from office. A number of the young sort of umbrella movement era leaders were banned from running for office. We saw very aggressive and systematic prosecution and jailing of many of the umbrella movement protest leaders. And so through this campaign of what I call lawfare, sort of using the legal system to target dissent, that really did cast a pall over the activist community and the protesting community in Hong Kong. And as Bonnie just alluded to, people were feeling somewhat dispirited. And so people would look at my book, City of Protest, and say, well, is Hong Kong still a city of protest, or is it in fact dead? But I would sort of, my response to that was that I think the underlying motivations driving protest in Hong Kong were still there and were just waiting for the right trigger. And the two things that I point to are firstly that Hong Kong, as we all know, has a deficit of democracy. It's a partly democratic system, but people can't really exercise their voice through the ballot box. And so systemically, protest is one of the few ways people have of political expression in Hong Kong. And then secondly, that political protest is an important part of Hong Kong identity. When people think about what makes Hong Kong special, what makes Hong Kong different from the rest of China, and in many ways from the rest of Asia, they point to what they call Hong Kong core values, which is the rights and freedoms that people enjoy, including freedom of expression, freedom to protest, a free press, and a legal system, an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and those things. And so when anyone in Hong Kong sees those rights being circumvented or trampled in any way, that is what inspires them to come out in protest in an almost visceral response. And by protesting, they are exercising those very rights that they seek to protect. So it becomes almost a performance of identity, as it were. So I think really those two factors were always there in Hong Kong, and we were just waiting for the right trigger to come along to spark protest again. And originally I had assumed that would be perhaps the Article 23 legislation if it was to be reintroduced, but it turned out that the extradition bill came along first, and all of these issues came to the surface, and the anxieties and the things that have been bubbling away over the previous 5 years burst out in this huge movement that we've now seen over the past month or so.
Great, thank you. And Mary, I know you've been obviously out on the streets a lot. You have been a very keen observer of this Hong Kong culture that we're seeing sort of try to, make itself heard and emphasize itself. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what you see as sort of an expression of Hong Kong identity through these protests?
Sure, yeah, I think one of the most surprising things over the course of this process, and Anthony and I were talking about this over lunch just now, is each time this process has happened, it's been larger, the scale has been greater, the scope has been greater than we would have expected. And even for this past weekend with the protest in Kowloon, we would have expected maybe a couple thousand, but the numbers were just blown way out. And that element of surprise, I think, speaks to the amount of energy that protesters have. And if we want to trace that energy back to its roots, I think it comes from what Anthony alluded to, this paradox where in Hong Kong you have liberty to exercise your freedoms and rights as a citizen, and which prepares citizens to be well-trained, they know how to exercise their rights, they know how to make their voices heard within the constraints of the system. But when a trigger comes along, this creativity, this energy, and this culture comes just bursting forth, it explodes. And as we've seen over the past 4 weeks, it's just kept exploding over and over again, and in different forms as well. I think during Umbrella, it was mostly 79 days of a very concerted effort to occupy streets, occupy the roads. But this time around, with this slight change in philosophy and slight change in tactics, we see that protesters are trying to be like water. They want to take on Bruce Lee's famous philosophy and change their tactics and keep things exciting. And I think that's what's really drawn international attention. We don't know what to expect. Each time the optics are a little different. The posters are very, very well designed. There's just a lot of creativity. And from all of that, we see Hong Kong culture kind of wrapped up in this neat little package that comes out differently each time. So one of the key ways I think we've seen Hong Kong identity, Hong Kong culture play out through these protests is the use of Cantonese. during the protests. We have this language of Hong Kong that's so core to the city's identity, really taking a front seat, from the slogans that have been used, for example, with how the protest itself, the anti-extradition protest from the very beginning, was termed 反送中. And as Anthony has pointed out, there's a little pun there where it sounds like Song Zhong, which sounds like seeing off a dead relative. And so there's this play on words that kind of that people can relate to. If you're from Hong Kong and you get this inside joke, pun, you feel more connected to your peers, even if you don't know them personally. And from spending more time with each other on the streets, packed shoulder to shoulder, in 30-degree weather, 90% humidity, you do feel this connection with them. And so that's one way that people have used language. And another way is just to really take the language of the government, where these protesters have heard messages that they don't like to hear, and to turn that into a form of dark humor, resistance, and a way to express their identity. So I guess famously now, we have a journalist on the streets who was being cleared off by the police, being sworn at. We had the police say, well, like the journalist said, no, I'm a journalist, I'm here doing my job, and the police officer said, well, journalist, your mum. And so that itself was supposed to be an insult against the press. But people turned around, and in the spirit of being water, in the spirit of creativity, they really turned that around and rallied around this phrase, and have been using it to hit back at the government. And similarly with Carrie Lam yesterday describing the bill as being dead, but still refusing to use the word withdraw. People have come around and come up with a whole list of saying, well, in Cantonese, there are many ways of saying something instead without actually using the word dead because it's taboo. And so there's just this fun wordplay, I think, that where you really see culture shine through.
Great. And I think, so one of the questions that I've been asked a lot by my editors and sort of people observing this all around the world is this idea of a leaderless protest. Like, how can a protest exactly be leaderless? Surely somebody must be there, must be organizing, and must be getting the permits and so on, right? And so that's, I think, a really interesting question for you, Bonnie. Like, how do you see the role as CHRF, within this framework where the protesters are trying to be like water and essentially be kind of leaderless and not directed by anyone?
That is a very good question. As I said in my introduction, that we all had evolved from the umbrella movement. And in the umbrella movement, there was a kind of discontent, an emotion saying that protesters, we do not want big stage. In Cantonese, 大台. It means that protesters do not want people to stand up on the stage and giving instructions to everyone. So I understand this emotion because protesters may think that people on the stage, they are more conservative, and when conservative ways do not work, protesters may want to do something a little bit more radical to make things change, to make things happen. So these kind of emotions had been in our society among our fellow protesters for quite a few years. So in this movement, the Civil Human Rights Front, we are well aware of this kind of emotion, and we do not want to be so-called big stage. We do not want to give instructions to this protester. Instead, we would give information to them, fact-checked information through our Telegram channel, through our Facebook pages. And instead of giving instructions to people, we would facilitate and coordinate things together. So we are organizers of these marches legally because we are applicants to the letter of no objection. We coordinate with the police. We make sure that in the marches everybody will be safe and everybody will be legal consequences free. But we do not give instructions. Many times, for example, the general strike, it had not been proposed by the Civil Human Rights Front. Instead, we saw a lot of people already taking this anti-extradition bill very seriously, and already a lot of small businesses and individuals, professionals, they are already putting statements on the internet saying that, oh, we are going to take a day off, we are going to encircle the Legislative Council, this is a very important date for Hong Kong, we must save Hong Kong, so we will leave our job for a few days and go to LegCo. So we see this coming, but instead of letting everybody to voluntarily doing what they find suitable, we decided to encourage people to do a general strike in a specific day where we consider to be the most important day to encircle the Legislative Council so that our power can be used most efficiently and most effectively. So the Civil Human Rights Front consider ourselves as the role I described. So I totally agree that this is a leaderless campaign. What we do is, as I said, facilitate, coordinate, but really every protesters are their own leaders.
Just ask a quick follow-up on that. Does it make things sort of complicated, like when you saw the more radical or more extreme measures taken, like storming the Legislative Council, what is then the pressure on a group like you to kind of come out and say something, either for it or against it, and does that sometimes put you in like a difficult spot?
Well, I believe how to respond to that. I believe the Civil Human Rights Front, as well as all the protesters, understand that when things more radical happen, we did not encourage that, and the protesters know that is their own voluntary actions. So actually, to answer your question, we responded with our conscience. We consider them as our fellow protesters. So when our fellow protesters love Hong Kong so much that they decided to take more radical actions, which means that they can face more serious legal consequences, even risking their safety and lives. What we respond is, of course, we have to make our power be united, not to be divided by the Hong Kong government and Beijing, as they obviously want this power to divide. We have to protect these people, and we have to give a legal consultation to these people, and we have to give emotional support to these people. But what we must do is to keep this power, keep all our fellow protesters to be united. And that's how for our campaign to carry on stronger and stronger.
Antony, we had a really interesting conversation about how and why protests in Hong Kong have become sort of more radical and more extreme. I know a lot of people were very surprised when they saw actions like the storming of the Legislative Council, and also have kind of been holding their breath to see what happens next. Why do you think things have headed in that direction?
I think we've seen with each successive protest movement over the years in Hong Kong, sort of each protest builds upon the previous one and draws lessons and experiences from the previous one. So when you look back to 2003, the anti-Article 23 march, that was a very large protest march, several 100,000, 500,000 people, and that march in itself achieved its aim. The government backed down and withdrew the Article 23 legislation. In the intervening years, one thing that I think activists in Hong Kong also saw was during the anti-WTO protests, when we had a WTO ministerial forum here in Hong Kong in 2005. Activists from all around the world gathered in Hong Kong. Particularly notably were the Korean farmers, who came very well organized, very well equipped, very much willing and prepared, and from their own experience protesting in Korea, to have direct conflict with the police. They came with life jackets and kickboards. They were going to jump into the harbour and swim around the police lines to get to the convention centre to protest there. And I think that really opened up the eyes of many of the protesters in Hong Kong, and we saw, as a result, slightly more radical actions during the Star Ferry Pier and Queen's Pier protests, where people were more willing to, directly face the police and be physically dragged away by the police. Then moving on to the anti-national education curriculum protests that Joshua Wong and Scholarism were involved in 2012, the idea of surrounding the LegCo and camping out at Tamar and also engaging in hunger strikes were tactics that were tried then, and then made their reappearance again in the umbrella movement in 2014. And then, as Bonnie's been describing, that the current protest movements have really drawn on the experiences of the umbrella movement. People saw that an extended occupation simply didn't work, so we've seen these highly mobile and agile protests where small groups of just a couple of hundred are able to shut down a government building. And when they do that, they get up and move off to the next target. They don't sit around and sort of encamp themselves. We've seen, again, this leaderless approach. We've seen on the morning of 12th of June, for example, really the entire infrastructure of the umbrella movement sort of spring up in the course of a couple of hours in the morning because people knew what to do, knew what kind of equipment was needed, knew the geographic layout even of Tamar and Harcourt Road and Admiralty Centre, and everything was just instinctively there. So I think each time people have been drawing on the previous lessons and then building on them and deploying them in new ways. And of course that led to the storming of LegCo, which was sort of the most extreme action that we've seen so far. It had been a red line that the government had never allowed protesters to cross in the past, and for some reason, and perhaps we can talk about that later, they chose to leave that red line unpoliced this time, and that led to the actions that we've seen. So where this all goes from here, I think, is a really interesting question, and what we're seeing is now the movement moving out into the suburbs, into Kowloon. We've got the protest planned for Sha Tin this weekend. We have Lenin walls springing up all over Hong Kong, and this, I think, is in itself is a new development for protest in Hong Kong. We're not just marching from Victoria Park to Admiralty anymore. We're spreading it out very widely among the community. So as we're seeing it just continuing to develop and to grow.
Mary, I'd like to ask, there's been a lot spoken about the relationship with the press and protesters, the press and police during the course of the past 4 weeks. We saw on Sunday night sort of a standoff that included even members of the press who were being kind of shouted at by police and were sort of shouting back. Do you think something has sort of fundamentally changed here with the relationship of the press and how they are allowed to cover protests, right? And whether that the benchmark has sort of moved for them somehow, and it's maybe a little bit more difficult now than it's been before.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've been out there too, Shivani, so I would love to hear your thoughts afterwards about how that's changed. But from personally, I haven't been shoved off, except for, police do want to clear locations, and just looking at, I'm not a media law expert by any means, I know very little about it, but my understanding is that journalists under Hong Kong media law aren't treated as any more special than your ordinary citizen, and so when police, even if a location is deemed newsworthy, journalists don't have special access, and if the police want to clear you off, and they're clearing off, and I think that raises probably some problems with the misuse of that power, and it means that journalists do get pushed off sometimes aggressively while covering protests, even if they're very clearly marked as members of the press, and so I think that's probably a larger conversation to be had also. And yeah, what about you, Shivani?
I think it's sort of been a moving target, right, in terms of the relationship with the press. But I would actually like to ask a question to all our panelists about, basically what's next, right? Like Anthony mentioned, and I think a lot of us know that there are protests planned for Kowloon this weekend. They're sort of moving out. They're moving away from the centers. It seems like protesters are trying all sorts of tactics, including withdrawing their money from Bank of China accounts. Where does this sort of go from here in terms of what's next? And when there is no clear leadership and everyone's sort of flowing like water, what does that mean for what we're going to see in the coming weeks?
I believe that Hong Kong people this time really act out what "be water, my friend" means. Hong Kong people are extremely creative, and we see Lennon walls all over Hong Kong now, and we see more and more marches, not only in Admiralty, from Victoria to Admiralty, but also now we had seen one in Mong Kok, and soon we'll have another one in Tseung Kwan O, all organized by netizens themselves, discussed among themselves in Telegram groups and social media. And so I believe that this sort of voluntary actions all over our city really can make the government to have headaches because they had never experienced that before, and it is very hard to throwing gas bombs to these people. If we gather together at Admiralty, it's easy for them to handle. But when we're all over the place, the government has to listen to these people. Otherwise, we can expect that these things will continue to happen. That's first. And secondly, as our demands had not been heard, the protest will carry on, but it may not be in the form of marches and demonstrations, but also in other forms. For example, we will soon have district council elections later this year, and a lot of netizens already are trying to fill up the constituencies that used to have no competition. There are about 100 of these constituencies, pro-Beijing candidates just elected because there were no competitions. So the last time I checked from a Facebook page, netizens are already enthusiastically filling up these constituencies. They're gearing up themselves to be politicians, to be candidates. So I really hope that in the coming elections, we can see a whole new atmosphere and a whole new generation of politicians, so we can transform the power from the streets into the political systems. Then the government is even harder to ignore our voices.
So, in the interest of time, I am going to open up to questions from the audience. Just a reminder, before you ask your questions, please state your name and your affiliation clearly, and questions, not statements. Thank you. Over there, in the front.
Hi, I'm To Han Shi, a freelance journalist. Two questions. One is, there are all these rumors that certain dark masterminds are behind these small minority of violent protesters who smashed the windows of the Ledge Coup building. What credence do you think some masterminds are organizing these, violent protesters as double agents? Would it be the Hong Kong police or the Carrie Lam or the Chinese intelligence services or the CIA or the British MI6? My next question is, there are all these mysterious new policemen who fill the ranks of the Hong Kong police without any identification. Who are they? Are they mainland Chinese police or mainland Chinese spies in secret?
Anthony, do you want to take that one?
I can certainly take the first question. As to the mysterious foreign forces or the Asian provocateur, I don't put any credence in any of them. In terms of, I guess, the first more obvious one, the sort of the CIA influence, the pro-Beijing sort of groups on social media circulate these photos of the foreign CIA agents who are supposedly organizing all of this. I know many of those people, and trust me, if that's the best the CIA can do, the CIA is in a lot of trouble. So that of course is patently ridiculous. In terms of the more serious question, were there some sort of infiltration of the movement by external forces? I also don't put a lot of credence in that, just because having been there that night and seeing that action unfold, it wasn't just the couple of hundred people that broke into the Legislative Council building, but thousands of people around watching, cheering them on. We had these sort of chains, human chains, passing supplies to them using the hand signals, and if you haven't seen the videos, you really should. They're very interesting. But these chains of protesters stretching all the way to the other side of Harcourt Road and supporting that action and sort of passing equipment through. So there were really many thousands of people at least actively supporting, if not tacitly supporting, that action. So I don't think it's feasible for a couple of black hands to have done that. So I think this is all, it is what people say it is. It's organic. organic. It's coming from the protesters themselves, organising through online chat groups and online forums and voting for what their next moves will be, and also sticking to this principle that Bonnie alluded to earlier of not splitting the movement and allowing people to take whatever action they feel in their conscience is right, and providing at least moral support even if they don't agree. As to the second question on the police, I'm not too sure. I don't know if any of you have experience of that. No.
I want to know the answer as well. we have to ask the police force.
Thank you. Hi, Tara Joseph with the American Chamber of Commerce. One thing that's been so fascinating about this movement is this leaderless aspect of it. And I wanted to ask whether that was an organic development that just happened, or whether it actually was thought through as to how it was developed that way. And also to Antony, is this a global first that we have a strong movement that is essentially leaderless and technology driven?
Well, yes, I believe that's totally organic, because if you go to the online forums, now very famous Leung, you can see all the discussions by netizens from discussing how to start an action, and then you see the details of that actions slowly, gradually forming up, etc. And then you also see when they took actions, like I remember one day those netizens, after discussing on the internet, they decided to block two government buildings at Wan Chai. And then after that, they quickly realized that people may not be happy about that. They fear that they are losing public support, losing the public opinion. And then they have decided, voted, and then go back to the drum of the Legislative Council to have deliberation to discuss, oh, we are now losing the public opinion, what we're going to do. And then later, the next day, these same young people went to the same place and distributing leaflets saying that we apologize for the inconveniences that had been caused, and but you have to understand why we do that. It's for the Hong Kong's best. We love Hong Kong so much. That's why we did that. So you can see the whole action from forming to deliberation to action. You see that all on the internet. Even the policemen can see these discussions. Even the TV live videoing how they discuss about it. So if you read all this information, you can see it's marvelous. It's totally organic. And more importantly, these people, as I said, they quickly evolve themselves. They quickly improve themselves. So I believe that these qualities can really gain public opinion.
I guess just two supplements to that first question. Firstly, that it also seems clear that this is a very deliberate response to the government's very aggressive prosecution of Joshua Wong and Benny Tai and Chan Kin Man and the other umbrella movement protest leaders, that if you don't have a leader, there's no one to target and to prosecute, obviously. And secondly, I find it interesting that it's sort of the way that this movement operates as a kind of participatory democracy in a way mirrors what they're striving for in the protest movement themselves. So it's an interesting enactment of sort of their ideals for perhaps how Hong Kong can function. But on your second question, it certainly does seem notable. I wouldn't be game to say it's a world first, but certainly it does seem notable and unusual among world protest movements, to the extent that actually one of the most common comments that I'm seeing, from some of my posts and videos on Twitter, are people in the US saying, hey, we need more of this in the US. If only we organized this way, and from sort of anti-Trump groups or sort of Democratic Party candidates sort of saying we need to use this to sort of get our message out in the US. So it's interesting that it does seem to be raising some eyebrows and attracting some international attention, certainly. So, yeah.
Katrina Hamlin, Reuters Breaking Views. To what extent do you think the city's economic situation, the wealth gap, rising property prices and so on, has played a role in fueling the protesters' anger and also their persistence? And if you think that has played any kind of role, to what extent do you think we might expect the government or perhaps those campaigning in the upcoming elections to try and address those issues?
Yeah, I think the economic question certainly is a very strong undercurrent in the entire movement. You have people feeling that there is a lack of social mobility, that there isn't much of a chance for them to get on the train and afford the down payment for an apartment that is probably the size of a stamp or a shoebox. And that issue itself probably stems from the lack of democratic representation in the political system. So I think all of that is interlinked, and there's this persistent low-level bubbling under the surface sense of frustration and dissatisfaction, and people try to figure out how to work within the confines of that system and try to survive and possibly even thrive given these conditions. But when you have something such as the extradition bill that just completely jolts the system, you do then get people coming out onto the streets. And so I think without the extradition bill itself would probably have already angered enough people, but without the underlying economic frustrations, the political frustrations, I don't know if it will be as widespread of a sense as we are seeing now.
I'm Steve Vines, representing absolutely no one. Can I ask, I think this is primarily for Bonnie, but can I ask you, I mean, do you worry about protest exhaustion? I mean, there's a limit to how many times people will come on the streets, will post messages on the Lenin walls, etc., etc. And is that something which is now concerning you?
Well, to be honest, at the beginning of the campaign, when we have 1 million protesters and then 2 million protesters, I was worried about we can't top up 2 million people, right? And I also feel that it's very hot. The weather is not very good for protest. Of course, we have worried about exhaustion. But as far as I observe from the internet and from face-to-face communications, Hong Kong people are very persistent and very determined. And I talked to people who had stayed at the Legislative Council for days. They slept there and they continue to be there. They have been dispersed by the police and then came back. And they are very determined that until our 5 demands are met, they will not leave. And I believe that is a very well-shared emotion among our Hong Kong protesters. I believe that it is because Hong Kong people do understand that this extradition bill is very important, because once it's passed, it will destroy the whole one country two system. It will destroy Hong Kong. It will make Hong Kong just another Chinese city. So our home will no longer be our home. We all have to consider immigration, etc. And also, secondly, what happened on the 12th of June, we see the policemen shooting our fellow protesters, and they even shooting journalists. And Hong Kong people take that into our hearts. And that is why 2 million people took to the streets even after the 12th of June. We once worried that, would people be worried about their safety so they wouldn't come out? But no, Hong Kong people came out. So as we understand the consequences of the extradition bill, and we are very, very angry about the government's attitude, Carrie Lam's arrogance, the police force misconduct. So although it is all very exhausting, but Hong Kong people will only come out again and again when our city needs us to be.
Thank you. Richard Ward, Ward Associates. My question relates to the technology that underlays the decentralized, organic kind of spontaneity that we're witnessing as the organizing principle here for the protests. What does this say about the prospects for representative democracy? Are we really seeing the advent of something that supplants that or will replace that? And secondly, isn't this all only possible, the protests only possible so long as the phone systems and the internet aren't shut down by government?
I can certainly speak to the second part of the question because I've thought about that myself. You're right that the use of technology has been key, and that's something the government could target. And indeed, we saw, and apparently, as reported by the Telegram CEO, a denial of service attack originating from mainland China directed at their service during the protests. But and yes, the government could shut down the mobile phone system or switch off the internet, as indeed they do in mainland China. I think the thing that really makes that impossible here is that that would destroy Hong Kong's status as an international financial center. I mean, Hong Kong relies on the free flow of capital, the free flow of people, but also, most importantly in this day and age, the free flow of information. And the minute that you bring that into question and say, well, in certain circumstances, the free flow of information will be cut off, all your internet access and your mobile phones will suddenly stop working in the middle of a trading day, for example, that's the end of Hong Kong as a financial center. So I think that would really prevent that being a practical option unless, that was, absolutely the last straw and, the end of Hong Kong as we know it, I think. As to the first part of the question, I don't know.
Sure, yeah, if I may add to that, I think going back to this idea of the leaderless movement, keeping people on their toes, I think that does make people realize that they have to keep coming up with new ideas, new ways to get their messages across, and they're not just up there following instructions. So I think that kind of plants this idea in people's minds that even if perhaps certain technologies are either made unavailable or are shut down, they will have to try and think of certain ways to get around that. And they've been doing that throughout the 4 or 5 weeks of protests now. And with the kind of high variability of the forms of protest, I think what we're also seeing is that they realize that they have to get they have to tailor their message to different audiences. So as we saw this past weekend, instead of just saying we want the extradition bill completely withdrawn, the protesters are trying to get their message across to mainland Chinese tourists, and that's something that I don't think we saw as concerted of an effort behind previously. And so I think that kind of that spirit, that psychology of needing to change and constantly come up with something new stems from that leaderless movement, and I think that's kind of what gives it its strength.
So in the interest of time, we'll take just one more question. Over there. No.
Thank you. I'm Alexandra Tracy from Hoiping Ventures. I wanted to pick up on what Mary said just then. I think most of the message of the protests has been very clearly directed at the government here, but there have been one or two elements that have been directly provocative of China. So the mainland tourists at the railway and the colonial flag in Legco being two very good examples of that. Do you think we're going to see more going in that direction? And is there a danger that it could just fall off the edge?
As I said, I believe that these protesters, they are when they discuss, when they deliberate all those actions, they clearly have thought things through. And when, for example, some people are going really radical, have some really radical ideas, and some other protesters will say, stop, this is going to ruin our campaign. So this is a self-improving mechanism. Very organic though. And so I do not believe that will go over the edge as you fear. And from the perspective of more about the Chinese government, right? I believe that the whole extradition bill is about Hong Kong people's fear of the Chinese judicial system. And so our whole campaign will be targeting at the Chinese government. But as fellow panelists had said before, that we will target those Chinese tourists who come to Hong Kong. We try to educate them. We try to tell them what Hong Kong is happening. A lot of netizens describe it as exporting revolution. So yes, we're trying to export our revolution to them. If they learn what Hong Kong people are doing, they may copy it and bring back to China. So we'll all be happy we'll all have democracy in Hong Kong and in China. So this is really what the netizens are trying to do, and I do not believe that it is all very educational and it's not going to go over the edge. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, our panelists.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. I think it was very provocative.